A warm welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club, and tonight we're very privileged to have a correspondent speaking. We do love bringing in the talent in this region, and it's fantastic to have Jonathan Miller here. Just before I get going, those of you who don't know me, I'm Jonathan Head. I'm the BBC correspondent and on the board of the Foreign Correspondents Club. Next week, if any of you are around on the 13th of June, we're hosting an event here looking at the challenges to freedom of expression in this region. And to be honest, you could have an event on that pretty much every month at the moment, the way things are going. We've got Prabhat Rajanapok, who of course is facing sedition charges here, talking about the law in Thailand, and bringing in people from Myanmar and also from Cambodia. We will see if we can get more speakers as well from other parts of the region. At the moment, freedom of expression is being challenged in this region in a quite exceptional way. Of course, we have our two colleagues, Walun and Joso U in Myanmar, who are currently on trial and have been in prison now for 6 months on charges of espionage for doing their job in trying to expose massacres in Rakhine State. Theirs is an extreme case, but there are many other cases. You think about Rapper in the Philippines, a very dynamic media, independent media, which is being pressured through rather dubious legal means and possibly shut down at some point. So it's a very important event, and it's something this club is very committed to. For us, freedom of expression isn't something we can be neutral about. It's the very core of what we believe in the club, and it's the very core of what journalists in this region believe in. Next Monday, we're also hosting an event on the 11th of June on outbound tourism from Thailand. And Thailand's always been this fantastic tourist magnet, but Thais themselves now are providing an enormous amount of tourism to the rest of the region. And some of the experts on the tourist trade here are now looking at this sort of reverse flow, and we'll be talking about that at the club on Monday. That's the 11th. But let's get on with tonight's event. And it's fantastic to have my dear friend and colleague Jonathan Miller here. Those of us who know him watched him struggle through this book. Jonathan only came back to Asia, it was 2016, wasn't it? Yeah. Having been based here back in the 1990s. He's a renowned journalist who's reported from many of the world's other trouble spots from Africa and the Middle East, but came back because he has a very strong personal ties anyway to this region. And his arrival back in Southeast Asia coincided with the rise of Rodrigo Duterte, this extraordinary, foul-mouthed, eccentric, populist leader who won a pretty resounding election victory in May of 2016, riding a wave of popular frustration, cynicism, and I think fear as well about what was happening in the Philippines. But it was also a very effective campaign, and there are parallels elsewhere in the world that tapped into social media and ignited a kind of popular support base. And Jonathan decided, having come back and reported, as we all did, some of the shocking developments in Duterte's first few months in office, where he launched this brutal and bloody war on drug dealers and drug takers, that it was an appropriate time for him to sit down and write a biography of this man. I don't think many other people would have taken on that challenge, but he's done it. Here it is. I hope any of you who haven't got it, the book is for sale down at the door there. The first full account of this man, what drives him and his background. He is a very unusual man. He's not like Donald Trump, as I'm sure Jonathan will tell you. He's got a lot of very strange motivations. So I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm going to let Jonathan kick off and tell you a little bit about what it was like writing this book and what his impressions were of Duterte and the political forces that he's unleashed. And after that, even if you haven't read the book, take advantage of the microphone and throw us some questions. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And it's a real, genuine pleasure to be here actually speaking in the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, of which I was, for a year, a board member, and I like to think that my lasting legacy will be my insistence that there should be an apostrophe after the word correspondence, which I felt was very important just to prove that we were a literate bunch of journalists. Thank you Jonathan, for that generous introduction. It is really, really wonderful to be here tonight and to be talking about this book, which I labored on here in Bangkok, having spent my time researching it over in the Philippines. This man, Rodrigo Duterte, is possibly one of the most divisive characters, political characters, certainly in this region today. He inspires fierce loyalty. He engenders great debate, and he attracts enormous criticism. I went to the Philippines as a reporter for Channel 4 News to report about his rise, and as it became increasingly clear that ever larger numbers of Filipinos were being killed in his war against drugs, to report on that war against drugs. When I researched and wrote this book, I was speaking to Filipinos. I take a dim view of the notion of foreign correspondents parachuting into countries and pontificating sagely about what they think is going on. This book is drawn from the words of those I talked to, from people who are at the sharp end of the war on drugs, Duterte's family, his friends, his colleagues, cabinet ministers, people who went to school with him decades and decades ago, and his many, many critics. When I started to look into Duterte as a foreign correspondent, I did, as all of us do, try to research as much as I could about who this guy was that I was dealing with. And I realized that actually there wasn't very much out there about him. There were some very, very good articles in the New York Times and the BBC, of course, and many other publications around the world had written incisively and over many years about this maverick character who'd been the mayor of a southern city in Davao in Mindanao. But there was no sort of pulling together of all the threads, and there was no book about him that actually made sense of who this guy was. So that's why I decided, that was the motivation to write this book. I felt that we needed to understand who this guy was, and I wanted to get the measure of this man. I wanted to know what made him tick. I wanted to understand him and what the influences on him were. And I wanted to understand why 16.6 million Filipinos voted him into power. Now, he's important because here in Thailand, he's in our backyard. He's unleashed a killing spree, which, by way of comparison, is, I think I'm right in saying, second only to Pol Pot in terms of the sheer number of civilian deaths. And he's only been in power 2 years. But he matters for bigger reasons than that. Duterte matters because of what he's come to represent. He is a populist authoritarian. He is a violent autocrat. He is, you know, when American journalists first started reporting on Duterte, they immediately drew comparisons to Trump. They called him the Trump of Asia. But as Jonathan pointed out, you know, the comparisons are paper thin. They found in each other sort of kindred spirits, and certainly Trump was quick to endorse his violent war on drugs. Duterte is in the same mold as well as Recep Tayyip Erdogan, of Viktor Orban of Hungary, of Xi Jinping, of Hun Sen. They've all got similarities, but as a former Filipino congressman and well-known commentator, Walden Bello, has called him, Duterte is a fascist original. He dresses up his populism in this sort of straight-talking, no-nonsense, I'll get things done style of politics. But I want to put in a nutshell, before we hit a bit of detail, just what he has done in the past 2 years. Because when you look at it, it's absolutely astonishing. He has eroded the key democratic institutions of Asia's oldest democracy. He owns Congress. When he extended martial law in the southern island of Mindanao until the end of 2018. Congress voted in his favor by 245 votes to 14. He owns the military. He's brought them back over to the dark side, as his leading political critic, Leila de Lima, has said, by imposing martial law in the south and letting them have free rein against jihadists and communists. He owns the police. He's turned them into a killing machine. He's jailed his leading critic, Leila de Lima, the former Justice Secretary and the initial investigator into his unbelievable human rights abuses as mayor of Davao City. She's been in jail now for a year and is an Amnesty International prisoner of conscience. One of the first things he did was to rehabilitate the Marcos clan and to give the nod to the reburial of Ferdinand Marcos, the dictator, in the Philippines Cemetery of Heroes. He's locked horns with the Catholic Church. Just recently, he has overseen the dismissal of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who was one of his leading critics as well. And he's stuffing that Supreme Court with those who support him. He has attacked the media. Rappler, which is a well-known online news agency and a news service and app, is under attack and under threat of closure by Duterte. And one of the leading newspapers, the Daily Inquirer, has been taken over by one of his business political allies. But what Duterte has done, perhaps more than anything, has been to normalize killing. In the first few months he was in power, he managed to kill 3 times as many people as Marcos managed in a decade, nearly a decade of martial law. And people shrug it off. If you're middle class and educated, and you don't venture into the slums of Manila or Cebu or Davao, you don't see the impact of what Duterte is doing with his death squads and his killers. It's the urban poor that are being killed in vast numbers. There are 2 things I'd just like to read from my own book, but not from my own words, which explain this business about why Duterte is important. The first, the words of a Filipino novelist called Miguel Sihuco, who I have got to know and I spoke to for the book. And he is writing, he's written about the Philippines in his book Ilustrado, and he's currently writing another book, a novel, based on Duterte's mistresses. Here's his observation when I spoke to him. History is repeating itself, Sihuco said. Even the names of the past are back. It's dangerous, not just because it's happening, but because we're letting it happen. Duterte represents what results when you allow democracy to be perverted, when the people consider it acceptable to have as ruler someone who is willing to discard the democratic checks and balances and any laws he feels inconvenienced by. What scares me most, he said, is what our democratic institutions will look like at the end of all this. The legislature, the courts, the media, the church, the opposition. He has gone after everyone who stood up to him and has very effectively used his mob of trolls and propagandists. The second little quotation I'd like to read, I quote in my introduction to this book. It comes from The Handmaid's Tale by the Canadian writer Margaret Atwood. And in her 1985 book, she wrote of the collective insouciance, if you like, of those who allow their society to be taken over in the way that Duterte has taken over the Philippines. Here's what she wrote. We lived, as usual, by ignoring. Ignoring isn't the same as ignorance. You have to work at it. Nothing changes instantaneously. In a gradually heating bathtub, you'd be boiled to death before you knew it. There were stories in the newspapers, of course, corpses in ditches. And over the months that I spent researching and writing this book, those words came home to me. Before I continue in any more detail, I want to just play you a piece that I reported last year. Duterte had been in power just over a year. This was a Channel 4 news piece, which just shows you the sort of reporting that we were doing for television. All of us were doing. Jonathan was doing it for the BBC, and many of my friends and colleagues here were doing it for news agencies and newspapers as well. But to give you just the lie of the land, a year into Duterte's tyranny, here's the piece. Tam, are you able to play that from there, or do you want me to hit the button? You can do it.
Please, tell to the whole world, help us, please, help me.
Marie Flore's son is dead.
It's not a dog, my son. It's not a dog or a pig to kill like them.
Shot by cops in a nightly back alley bloodbath. This is the Philippines' war on drugs, a reign of terror licensed by the president himself, where death squads roam the slums and cops shoot to kill. 10,000 dead in a year, most dirt poor. The 32 people shot by police in raids on Monday night alone, in a province just north of Manila, was their bloodiest night so far. Many more will have been killed in hits by masked men on motorbikes, as they are every night. Sick of lily-livered liberals in government, 16 million Filipinos voted Rodrigo Duterte into office. He loves guns and girls and motorbikes, swears at foreign leaders, claims to have killed men himself, cracks jokes about rape, and speaks in unvarnished language.
President Rodrigo Duterte, Republic of the Philippines.
As a local mayor, they'd called him Duterte Harry, after Clint Eastwood's shoot first, ask questions later cop. As president, that's what he ordered his cops to do. Suspects on watch lists are gunned down in supposed police shootouts or assassinated by vigilante killers who whistleblowers claim are mostly cops off duty. Today, Duterte Harry's pinning medals on chests and promising he'll watch their backs.
If you have to shoot them dead. And this is what is the human rights idiots are trying to complain. You know, when I say I shoot them dead, I prefer to shoot them in the heart or in the head. If you insist on a drug war, I will kill you all. I will kill you.
Buoyed by Donald Trump's praise for the unbelievable job he is doing, Duterte claims the Philippines is a narco-state in the throes of a drugs pandemic.
I will kill you if you destroy my country.
He's a populist authoritarian with an iron fist. He does not brook defiance, and his grip on this country of 100 million people is tightening.
President Duterte has a strongman swagger. It's a sort of godfather charisma, which Filipinos like to call his gangster charm. During his turbulent first year in office, he has declared martial law across the southern Philippines. He has intimidated and attacked his critics in the judiciary, in the opposition, in the media and the church. And his chief critic, his most outspoken critic, Senator Leila de Lima, languishes in a jail cell about 100 yards from here inside police headquarters.
Leila de Lima, former Human Rights Commissioner turned Justice Secretary, is Duterte's nemesis.
Depending on who you believe, you could be arrested shortly.
Oh yes.
Have you been expecting this?
Yeah, I've been expecting the worst already. You know, they're capable of the worst things. They're gonna
De Lima had investigated his links to a death squad in the city he once ran as mayor, and as a senator continued to dig into Duterte's violent past and present.
He's a very dangerous person and is a dangerous president, but I refuse to be silenced. I refuse to be intimidated.
Days later, De Lima was arrested on drugs charges and remains locked up inside police HQ, where she is now an Amnesty International prisoner of conscience. Jose Manuel Chel Diokno is the Philippines' leading human rights lawyer, whose father was jailed under the disgraced dictator Ferdinand Marcos 35 years ago. In just 1 year, he says, Duterte has killed 3 times as many as Marcos managed in a decade of brutal military rule.
The war on drugs is really a pretext for a war on law. It's really a war against the rule of law. To me, it's a very clear attempt to displace justice from the courts with justice from the barrels of guns. When you have a situation where the legal system is virtually means nothing anymore, then the only kind of government that will be capable of maintaining order in the country will have to be some type of authoritarian government.
The proclamation of martial law is not a military takeover.
It was, though. Martial law under Marcos was so long ago that most Filipinos have no memory of what it was like. Duterte called Marcos the best president the Philippines ever had and ordered the corrupt dictator's reburial in the Cemetery of Heroes. As he worked to rehabilitate the Marcos clan, including his supporting an electoral challenge which could yet see Ferdinand Marcos Jr. appointed his vice president, Duterte himself declared martial law across the southern island of Mindanao and gave the army a free hand in waging war against Islamists and communists. It's 3 months now since a group of jihadists seized the city of Marawi. Unable to flush them out, Duterte extended military rule in Mindanao until the end of this year, using his supermajority in Congress, and mulled its extension nationwide. 4 out of 5 Filipinos are Catholics, but despite his brutal drugs war and his calling Pope Francis a son of a whore, Duterte is more popular now than when he was elected. He has viciously attacked church leaders who've spoken out against the killings, but some still do.
It's really an authoritarian dictatorial rule without even a formal declaration of martial law all over the country. He controls Congress and now even the police. It is becoming a killing machine. I believe he reflects the worst version of ourselves as Filipinos. There is a Duterte in many of us. Someone who lacks mercy and compassion, who is rude, who is brutal, who doesn't respect the law.
The president's spokesman dismissed our questions as malicious.
I think we need to understand where the president is coming from in the context of the Filipino people. He has conducted himself is really not as a strong man, but I would say a strong leader, a firm and decisive leader who is not wishy-washy. He knows his issues, he knows what to do, and he goes after it. Very decisive and not pandering to, let's say, Western liberal perspectives.
Duterte has sworn to kill those who destroy the youth of his country, but many are deeply alarmed by the direction he's taken and believe he's just addicted to killing.
Jonathan Miller in Manila.
So look, there is a portrait of the President of the Philippines. When I was looking into how, to cover him, I mean, a lot of the words jumped out of the page at me as to how he was described. You saw words like his swagger, the gangster warlord, iconoclastic, narcissistic, mercurial, misogynistic. I went to the Netherlands early on in my research for writing this book, and I met Jose Maria Sison, who was the founder of the Communist Party of the Philippines and was a lecturer of Duterte at university when he was studying law. And he described Duterte as a bundle of contradictions. Now that is absolutely spot on, but there is one word which comes up repeatedly in descriptions of Duterte, and ironically, It's actually used on the back of this book, the first biography of Rodrigo Duterte, the murderous, unpredictable president of the Philippines. Now, word unpredictable. He is unpredictable in many ways, but in others, it is the wrong word to use, because everything that Duterte has done as president was actually entirely predictable. If you look back at his dark past, and many of those who knew what Duterte had done as the mayor of the city of Davao, what they realized was that what he was capable of. They knew these death squads would come to haunt the entire country. Again, I'd just like to read you one little bit of the book. It's a story which I've actually discussed with Jonathan, because he interviewed the same woman, and she's been talked about many people over many years. Her name is Clarita Alia, and she's a mother and in Davao of 4 boys, and she runs a market stall in a very poor area of the city. She was initially interviewed by Human Rights Watch way back in, I think, 2009 for a report that they did, in which they named Duterte as about how he'd run these death squads. Mother of 4 boys, I should add, who have all been killed, one after the other, by the death squads of Davao. And she talked about 18-year-old Richard. He was the first to be stabbed, then Christopher, his 17-year-old brother, then Bobby, and then finally little Fernando, who was 15, stabbed to death for sniffing, after being found sniffing glue. In August 2016, I went to meet Clarita Alia while working on a Channel 4 News report in Davao. 15 years had elapsed since the first of her sons was killed, but sitting with her at the stall she still runs in the market, Clarita remained raw with her mother's grief. She went into the lean-to shack behind the stall and came back clutching photographs. Tearfully, she recounted her tragic story, just as she had for the Human Rights Watch investigators years before. She conceded that her sons had indeed been local terrors. Anywhere else, they may have run the gauntlet of the police, but not been stabbed through the heart by a municipal assassin. The last picture showed 14-year-old Fernando, the year before he died. She had sent him off to school on nearby Samal Island to keep him out of trouble. He's standing, smiling, in a stripy navy shirt, leaning on a red Honda motorbike with his school satchel on his back. He scarcely looked his age. I asked her who she blamed for all that had befallen her. She answered with one word: Duterte. Again, she broke down in tears. It really hurts because it started with my sons, she sobbed. It saddens me that they're doing this everywhere now. I saw this coming. I warned them that he would do this everywhere. And sure enough, he has. He has become well known internationally for his rough-edged appeal, his bad language, his son of a whore to the Pope, to Obama. I will kill you. You saw him there on the screen shouting, I will kill you. This is his most common refrain. He makes jokes about rape. He speaks what appears to be the salty, rough language of the poor. But this is an act. It's a lie. Rodrigo Duterte came from a very privileged background. He's the son of a governor. The governor of Davao, when it wasn't just a city, but a large province. He likes to cultivate the mythology of sort of being this badass, but the reason he speaks this language of the poor is because he was assigned a bodyguard as the son of the governor of Davao. He skipped school, hung out with the bodyguards, listened to the way they spoke, mimicked them, learned to leer at women, learned to drink, smoked a lot, and learned to shoot guns. It's an act. He makes claims on stage. In his presidential campaign, he claimed to have killed himself. Several times he claimed this. And subsequently, he boasts that he killed. He never quite gives enough detail self-incriminate and make himself prosecutable. But he claims to have killed, he claims to have thrown a corrupt businessman out of a helicopter. He claims the first person he ever killed was on a beach when he was a teenager, 16 or 17 years old. And then he claimed once that in the siege of Marawi, which you saw in that report, when he declared martial law, he said that he had been forced to do so because a senior policeman in Marawi had been beheaded by these Islamists, and it was so disgusting he felt compelled to declare martial law. 2 days later, the Washington Post went down to Marawi and found the man who was alleged to have been beheaded. His head was squarely on his shoulders. He was fine. But by then, it didn't matter. The news was out. This is how it was received by the rest of the world. This is how it was received by the Americans, the State Department, by the Europeans. It felt perfectly justifiable that martial law should be declared in these terrible, heinous circumstances of such an abhorrent murder and the takeover of the town by Islamists. It was a lie. Duterte himself said in February 2017 that only 2 or 3 of every 5 things that he says or claims is actually true. And it wasn't actually clear whether that in itself was a lie or true. There's so much of what he said, of what he claims, is lies. He lies about the statistics in his drugs war. One of my colleagues is here tonight, Andrew Marshall from Reuters, and his team has investigated the killings and the numbers, the statistics of the drugs war, and found them to be inflated and absolutely uncorroboratable. When they published their conclusions about these statistics, they were condemned by the Malacanang Palace as malicious and referred to the National Police. The government has lied about the numbers in the drugs war as well. Sorry, I'm going to turn my phone off. There is no doubt about the sheer scale of the killings. We know that at least 10,000 have been killed. The political opposition claims that number is 20,000. But the police have downgraded that number to about 4,000. And that's the number that's actually being cited by some news agencies. I noticed that AP the other day was quoting 4,000. That's the official police statistic. It's not true. And this book goes into how the drugs war works, how it's prosecuted through the use of lists, how people are placed on lists as suspects, how kids are caught up in the drugs war, how people who have mistaken identities have been killed in this drugs war. And it tells the stories of individuals who are on the run, who, having been placed on lists, despite their claiming never to have been involved in drugs. And this is because they say their neighbors have informed them and placed their name on lists. This has turned the Philippines into a nation which is essentially Duterte's Republic of Fear. The message, however, despite the lies, resonated, particularly with the middle classes, who felt that there was indeed a drugs pandemic in the Philippines. The numbers, of course, had been announced by Duterte as being in the millions. In fact, the Dangerous Drugs Board of the Philippines had said that there were thought to be about 1.8 million drug users in the Philippines in early 2016, and these users were sometime users, and most of them were marijuana smokers, not crystal meth addicts. But by the time Duterte was president, he'd raised the number to 2 million, then 3 million, then 4 million, then 5 million, then maybe 6 million, he said, drug addicts. And he convinced the Philippines that there was a drugs pandemic, which was the reason why there was a crime pandemic. And the middle classes thought, well, you know, if this guy's coming in and promising to get rid of this is a good thing. And he used the sort of same technique, political technique, as Donald Trump did with his politics of anxiety and fear. in the way that Trump used, pointed the finger at Mexicans and immigrants. Duterte's enemy were the drug addicts. He also told lies about what he'd done in his past in Davao City. He called Davao Exhibit A. He claimed to have healed this city of its violence and woes, and there is no doubt that Davao was a very, very violent city. But after 22 years in power, Duterte claimed to have made it possible for people to walk down the street and not have their handbags snatched or their mobile phones snatched, where it was safe. And he claimed also to have ended the problem of drug abuse in Davao City. In 2016, the month Duterte was elected, 10 days after the election, 17,000 drug addicts in Davao surrendered to the police in case they were killed by assassins on motorbikes. That is not a city that has been cured of drug addiction. Davao City was also incredibly corrupt. There was a slush fund known as an intelligence fund, which was used by Duterte to bankroll the death squads, which went out and did the killings for him. He claimed to have stopped the murders in Davao. He claimed that it used to be the murder capital of the Philippines, but it remains the murder of the capital of the Philippines to this very day. There's about 2 years ago, I see a colleague of mine from Channel 4 has just walked in. We'd gone to Australia a couple of years ago to report on Nauru, which is the island on which the Australian government has dumped unwanted immigrants who arrived by boat. And we interviewed, as part of this report that we did, a whistleblower who had been contracted. He was a psychiatrist contracted by the Australian government to go and work on Nauru. And he spoke very poignantly about conditions on this island. And I stayed in touch with this guy. And a few months later, he sent me a short story by a writer called Ursula Le Guin. Now, Ursula Le Guin is best known for her science fiction, and she died, I think, earlier this year. But she wrote in 1973 an award-winning short story called The Ones Who Walked Away from Omelas. And this story is about a city which is perfect in almost every way. It's lovely. It's full of happy people, pretty girls with flowers in their hair, music playing. The market is thriving. It's a lovely place to live. But Omelas, the city, has got a very dark secret. And the dark secret is that there is a child who is in a basement and not fed and kept in terrible conditions. And everybody in Omelas knows about this child. But they just think, okay, so we'll just let it go. And some of them go and see the child. Some of them just are aware of it. And a few people think, I'm not happy living in this city with knowing that this is going on. And they're the ones who walk away from Omelas. And this story can be interpreted on many levels. I mean, some people see it as sort of like how we all are content to use our smartphones, despite the knowledge that the minerals, the components, some of the components are mined in war zones by slaves. And, yet we use these every day. We wear our trainers made in sweatshops in parts of Southeast Asia, and our shirts made in sweatshops in Bangladesh. But it fuels our lifestyle, and we can live our happy lives knowing that all this goes on. That's our little dark secret. But when I went to Davao City, that was when this guy, this whistleblower, sent me the story. And I read it one night in a hotel room in Davao City, and I thought, oh my God, I'm actually sitting in Omelas. This city, Davao City, claims that everything is happy about it, everything works, business is booming, there's construction, and people are happy. They claim that you can walk through the markets, even the red light district, without fear of being killed or having your phone snatched. And yet everybody knows that in this city, a death squad still exists, as it has for 20 years. And I found this a terribly powerful image. This city which Duterte ran had this dark secret, and now he has essentially nationalized a franchise which is running nationwide. He's got these death squads running nationwide. Duterte does not like being criticized. He does not like people who raise his human rights record or question it. He is a man who, and again I would just like to quote a little bit from the book, who was cast by a psychiatrist during the annulment of his marriage as suffering from a narcissistic personality disorder with aggressive features. The psychiatrist concluded that what she characterized as his gross indifference, his insensitivity, his self-centeredness, his grandiose sense of self and entitlement, his manipulative behaviors, his lies and his deceits, as well as his pervasive tendency to demean, humiliate others, and violate the rights and feelings. In summary, Rodrigo's personality disturbance, which constitutes his psychological incapacity, is deemed serious, incurable, and with antecedents. And this is the guy who today is in charge of running the Philippines. He's thin-skinned. He cannot take criticism. He locks up his political enemies. Human rights activists he has threatened to behead. Right now there's a Filipino nun, or an Australian nun who's 72 years old and has been working there for 30 years, who's threatened with deportation because she stood up against Duterte and criticized his drugs war. I think his ultimate game plan is to stay in power. He likes to make out that he's on death's door, but those who know him and have followed him for a long time suggest that this is actually just his way of seeing which vultures are circling. He'll continue, I believe, to work his authoritarian project and continue with his authoritarian rule. I don't think he needs to declare martial law in the Philippines because he's essentially already got all the control that he needs. And that's why that quotation by Margaret Atwood about the gradually heating bathtub struck a chord with me and chimed, because I felt, that yes, this is happening in the Philippines, but we're sitting in a world where authoritarian populism is a growing trend, is on the rise. And I think that quotation sums up exactly what is happening, not only in the Philippines, but elsewhere, which is why this book about Duterte is bigger and more important than just the man himself.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Look, there's a microphone there. I would encourage any of you who've got questions about any aspect of the Philippines or Duterte to come up. Please identify yourselves, and if you can, stick to one question.
Hi there, I'm Steve Finch. I'm a freelance journalist based here in Bangkok. At the end of last year, Duterte had a satisfaction rating of 70 plus in December last year, which is the highest of any sitting Filipino president since polls began nearly 40 years ago, and that's a year and a half after he started as president. You mentioned in the Channel 4 piece that you did earlier, that people forget about Marcos, people forget about the past. There's a new generation, but we've had a year and a, when this poll was taken, there was a year and a half of Duterte already, and we very clearly saw what he was doing. So how do you explain, now that he's in power, now people are seeing what he's been doing, that actually, I don't know the latest polls, but it's only towards the end of last year, the polls kept going up and were the highest that the Philippines has ever seen.
Yes, I mean, the polls have been absolutely extraordinary. I mean, in the early days of his presidency, in certain parts of the Philippines, he was enjoying opinion poll ratings similar to those of totalitarian dictators in Central Asia. I mean, like 96% in Davao. You know, when he was elected, he won a higher percentage of the votes and a greater number of votes than any president since a rigged poll which brought Marcos back into power in 1972. He has remained incredibly popular. In fact, his support base has, in large part, I mean, he appealed across the board, but in large part, it was the urban poor who loved his salty language and laughed at his jokes, who voted him in. He also appealed to the overseas Filipino workers, the OFWs, who are spread all over the world, many of them maids or mariners, and you know, whenever he goes to abroad, he checks in with these people, and he remains incredibly popular with these Filipino workers abroad, because they believe that he is keeping the Philippines safer and protecting their families. Now, there are others. I've spoken to Filipino academics recently in Australia who believe that part of the explanation for his popularity lies in the attraction through their being marginalized. Populism is attractive to people who have themselves been marginalized. They like a strong leader who promises to get things done. And you know, I think there are those who marvel at the fact that Duterte remains as popular as he has. I mean, the only dent that I noticed in his ratings came at when a 17-year-old called Kian Lloyd de los Santos was murdered in August 2017, and people were genuinely shocked by the brutality of that killing by plainclothes police. But you know, he does remain highly popular, and there is no sign at all that popularity is really waning. And you know, it's I guess there are other populist figures around the world who also continue to enjoy these high poll ratings, and there would be probably many explanations as to why they retain these ratings. I cannot quite believe, on having researched this book, seen how Duterte lied and pulled the wool over the eyes of the Filipino people, that they have continued to believe his lies.
Marwan.
Congratulations, Johnny. Good book. I mean, as somebody who's familiar with death squads and wars, and what was very curious about the argument you present here is, you know, there has to be an enabling environment. Generally, those who feel satisfied by authoritarian leaders look down or dehumanize the victims, whether it's on ethnic fault lines or ideological fault lines or political fault lines. What is the fault line in the Philippines that you sort of teased out in your book, where the people who support him can go to bed and sleep comfortably knowing that, well, that person who was killed is less human than me? Thanks.
Marwan, it's a very interesting question, that, because I mean, he has dehumanized. I spent a very poignant night out on what is known as the night shift in the Philippines quite early on, with Julian Haddon shooting on camera when we went out. And we followed, actually no, on this occasion it wasn't, it was Al, my other cameraman, and we went out on the streets of Manila, and we followed the story of a photographer called Luis Liwanag. Now that piece that we just showed starts with the story of you know, this woman who'd had her son killed like a pig, she said, and those pictures were shot by Luis. I went out filming with Luis, and you know, within like less than an hour of hanging out at police headquarters, we had we'd heard about a killing that we raced to the scene of, and we arrived there. It was in Mandaluyong, pretty central Manila, and it had only happened like minutes before, and there was a dead man lying in the gutter, and in fact, Luis's picture of that actual incident is right there in the center of this book. Now, all the time that Luis was taking these pictures, I was talking to him and asking him what he felt about it. Now, this guy was, you know, he was in his 50s. He'd cut his teeth as a reporter or as a photojournalist during the Marcos time. He was no spring chicken, and the other reporters and photographers called him Sir Luis. And he had come back to document this drugs war because he felt that what was happening was so important, and he wanted to document the rise of this new authoritarian. Luis spoke to me about how people were being killed like insects, and that resonated with me, because, and I thought about this many, many times over the months that followed. What Duterte has done, he might not have called the drug addicts cockroaches, but he and his cohorts, his henchmen in Malacanang, have said that they are not human. And therefore, if they're not human, they don't deserve human rights. Now, this is classic fascist speak. This is the purposeful alienation, marginalization of a section of society which you just turn them into victims, and that is how he's operated, and you can see it in the way that other dictators have done this in the past. So this, you know, one of the things I've been very conscious of is not to suggest for a moment that, you know, Duterte is running some banana republic, or that the Philippines is necessarily responsible for the rise of this man. This could happen anywhere. He's a human being. He just happens to be Filipino, but he uses exactly the same dehumanizing tactics as dictators do anywhere.
Pardon me, a follow-up. You know, I mean, this reminds me of Latin America. But even in Latin America, where you had death squads, there was a fault line. In other words, people felt they were on the right side, quote unquote, of the state because they were not communists, for instance, right? Whereas here, what I'm trying to figure out or tease out from you is whether there is a fault line where people say, well, we feel safe, the state's going to protect us under Duterte, and the other guy is going to be killed, well, we don't care. What separates people in feeling this way, or is there a sense?
Okay, so look, Duterte Harry, as in the Clint Eastwood character, is a vigilante cop who believes that what he's doing is right, and he's protecting people. Rodrigo Duterte does exactly the same thing. He believes that he's on the side of the angels. He believes that he's protecting people, and people believe him and his propaganda. He claims to have cleaned things up. He claims to have made things better, and people still believe him. And he's foisted this lie on people. It's not their fault that they've believed it, because, you know, it's coming from the words of the president himself. And, you know, yes, it's true. The comparisons with Latin America are right. I mean, like, Duterte very quickly ushered in death squads, which is something that we associate with Latin America. I think there will come a tipping point. But right now, I also believe that most people, while fearful of his motorcycle killers and aware of the fact that the slums are not safe places to be, still somehow believe that he's making the Philippines a safer place, because he has convinced them that the drugs pandemic, as he calls it, is an existential threat to the security of their country.
Jonathan, I just wanted to add something on that, because if my observation, excuse me a moment, but it was what struck me in the Philippines talking to people was that the poor support Duterte in the same way they supported Estrada and supported Marcos. They just love a tough guy, even though the people are dying in their neighborhoods. It was a certain strand of the middle class who'd been persuaded that their country was in dire mortal peril, and the persuasion came very late. They weren't thinking about it that much up until Duterte ran. Remember, he was a very late entrant. He was only running for the 5 months before the presidential election. He persuaded them that their country was in mortal peril. And I've spoken to really intelligent, actually genuinely compassionate people who still support him, very uncomfortable with the killings, uncomfortable with what's going on, but they've been persuaded that he's their only hope. They say, we have to back him, whatever he does, because if we don't back him, the country will just slip back into disaster. And it's a very clever trick he's pulled off, that he's persuaded people who didn't believe it a year before that their country is in mortal peril and that they must back Duterte, they must give him free rein.
And also, I mean, so many years have gone by. More than a generation has passed since Marcos. The young, the median age of the Philippines is something in the mid-20s. 30 years has elapsed since Marcos. They've forgotten what it's like to live under dictatorship. There is a sort of collective memory which is there somewhere, but most people have no personal recollection. And therefore, when a guy comes in and uses very amusing, attractive, funny, salty language and makes these brazen promises and presents himself as a man of the people, they buy it.
Question, please.
Robin Shell, member of the club. What can we do about it, and how can we prevent something like this happening in countries from which we come?
I love a short question, but I tell you what, I'm not the person to answer that one. I mean, you know what? As a journalist, what my role has been here is to document something which, although being documented well by other journalists for all their publications and broadcast media, has not been really put into a book form yet. When you pull it all together, I feel that the answer to your question lies probably with international justice. Now, it is quite clear that Rodrigo Duterte is scared shitless of the International Criminal Court. His country was a member of the International Criminal Court until he pulled out of it a few weeks ago. And he is still essentially prosecutable under international law and could one day stand trial in The Hague. However, at 72, he's probably also confident that because the wheels of justice turn so slowly, it is unlikely that he will stand in the dock like some of the warlords or dictators from Africa, or we've seen with the International Tribunal on Yugoslavia with Karadzic and Mladic and Milosevic and that lot. Duterte is really scared of that, and he's doing what he can to prevent the investigation into him. But the International Criminal Court has launched what is called a preliminary investigation into the killings since June 2016, when he became president. I think if there's an answer at all, it lies in that. And there are many Filipinos who are brave and have taken risks to expose not only the lies of his past, but what he's been doing as president. And there are lawyers and politicians who've stuck their necks out and put their heads above the parapet, and they're at grave risk for doing so. But these people have brought to the attention of the International Criminal Court what Duterte is accused of having done.
Ginny.
Well done on your achievement, Johnny. This segues to the latter part of your answer. If you could just expound a bit on what civil society groups are doing in the Philippines in response to this human rights crisis. And also, if you could specify some of the media that is stepping forward to try to document this and report on it. Thank you.
I've been humbled and deeply impressed by the work of Filipino NGO groups, human rights groups, civil society groups, who have stood up in the face of sometimes grave and mortal threats against Duterte. You see it. For example, I mentioned the killing of Kian Lloyd de los Santos. I don't know if you can see this, but in the in the book there's a picture here of a young man at Kian's funeral last August, holding up a poster, "Justice for Kian, justice for all the victims of Duterte's drugs war." There is a nascent movement not only opposing the drugs war, but opposed to Duterte himself. There are politicians who are willing and outspoken in their criticisms of Duterte. There are human rights groups, activists throughout the country who have done this. And there is a very brave segment of the Filipino press that has continued to not only report what is happening, but to offer commentary and opinion pieces criticizing Duterte. This is an incredibly brave thing to do. For me, for Jonathan, for others here who've gone in as foreign correspondents to the Philippines, we can leave. We can get out. These other journalists, these human rights workers are stuck there. And I believe the noose is tightening. I don't think it's going to get any easier for these people. Every week seems to bring a new bit of legislation or a new crackdown on somebody somewhere, or more threats from Duterte. It's not easing up. So I think that we need to be extremely aware of it, and you know, before it becomes a disaster, make sure that the rest of the world, us as journalists, we need to know that, make sure that the rest of the world is aware of the seriousness of what is happening over there.
Next question, please.
I have a combination comment and question. I want to quote Hermann Goering, but I don't have the exact quote. So the question is, does anybody have the exact quote? Because what he said while waiting for his trial, or after his trial in Nuremberg, in an interview, famous interview, was that farmers can be motivated to abandon their farms, go off to foreign countries to kill or be killed if you make them afraid that their country is in great danger. I just wonder if anybody has that exact quotation.
Well, I don't, but it does ring a bell, and is exactly what is happening in the Philippines. Thank you.
There was one other interesting aspect to I from observing Duterte, because obviously you've observed him more closely, I wonder whether you picked up on it. He talks a lot about killing, this love of killing. I mean, I can't think of another authoritarian leader who's so open about his welcoming of killing and of death, and it seems almost as though he believes some kind of spilling of blood is needed to heal the country. He has this very Manichaean dark vision, very brooding. I mean, did you sense that in what you picked up about him, that he has an almost uniquely bloody and violent vision for how you fix the problems in the Philippines?
Yeah, I mean, there are those more qualified to make this judgment than me who described Duterte as a psychopath. One of the things that amazed me most was when, on the day he was elected, Duterte went to Tondo slum, which is one of the biggest and most depressing slums in the world. And it's an astonishing place. I filmed in there with Gillian. It's huge. And it's just a pile of humanity living in the most grotesque conditions. And these people voted for Duterte, and he headed straight down there the day he was elected, and he said, these drug addicts, we've got to kill them. Kill them. If you know any drug addicts, kill them. And if your sons are drug addicts, kill them. And if you find it hard to kill your own son, get somebody else to do it for you, because I know it must be very difficult. I was thinking, seriously? This guy is the president of a country, and he's inciting killing like this? I'd never heard anything like it. And yet, when you look back, as I did in writing this book, to reports going back, I don't know, maybe 2008, 2009, there was an Australian guy who was the head of the UN panel on extrajudicial executions, and he came and did a study in Davao, and he looked into the killings in Davao City at the time, the death squad, and he said this guy, the mayor of Davao, is behind this death squad. He's behind it, and he described him as an authoritarian populist. It was well known that Duterte had a taste for blood. It was well known that he was addicted to killing. And that's what I find just quite hard to understand about how I think perhaps people didn't take him seriously. They liked his bravado, they liked the rhetoric, but they didn't actually think he would do it, but he did. He actually killed people, huge numbers of them. And so it was an addiction.
Jonathan, I've got a question here from somebody who's not actually in the club at the moment, but has obviously got an idea about what you're saying, or at least he's passed the question up to me. He is arguing that, this is Kevin Hughes, who's an FCC member, that the Philippines has always been a lawless, corrupt and violent place. And you know, that's why Duterte was elected. He feels that you've kind of made your mind up about him. He's asked, why do you seem to be siding with the predators who sometimes make life a living hell for innocent Filipinos by castigating a popular and duly elected leader who, flamboyant and sometimes crude though he may be, is trying to do something about it? You can't expect to apply Western jurisprudence in what is often a war zone. So I'll throw that to you.
Well, that's a very interesting question. Thank you, Kevin, vicariously. I mean, the Philippines is a lawless, violent place and has been for a very long time. It's also had years of sort of corrupt liberal governments, or sometimes with sort of populist leaders like Erap Estrada, who've just failed to deliver. There's been no economic trickle down at all. At all. I mean, it's just astonishing how, I mean, it is one of the most unequal societies, certainly in Southeast Asia. It would surprise me if it wasn't the world as well. It is a desperately unequal society. And I think Duterte came in as an insurgent outsider saying, I'm going to transform things. I'm going to get rid of these oligarchic elites of imperial Manila, and I'm the guy from the south, the insurgent outsider who came to save the Philippines. And he loves to cast himself as the savior, the man on the white horse who rides to the rescue. And people loved that, and they believed it. And I can't deny the fact that he was democratically elected, and so was Hitler. Duterte was very popular, remains very popular, and yes, he's attracting Chinese investment into roads and railways, desperately needed in Manila and between cities. There's no doubt about it. Nobody contests the fact that the Philippines desperately needs investment. But as his former political rival in Davao City said to me, when he was mayor of Davao, Rodrigo Duterte was not known for his infrastructure projects. He was known for his death squads. And sadly, that's what he's doing as the national leader. I feel that it is important that we apply international standards to him, not sort of as the palace described me, as sort of wishy-washy liberal sentiments. These, you know, when a country belongs to the United Nations and signs up to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they should be held to abide by those principles. And it's not me who's judging Duterte. I'm judging him by the same measuring rod as we would judge any leader anywhere.
Hey, you got a little quiet in the bar, please. Next question, Dan.
Thank you very much for a fascinating evening. I don't know whether Duterte has read the book that you've written. It sounds like he might well have done. Have you faced any personal retaliation for this? And do you ever plan to go back to the Philippines?
I'm gonna touch wood 3 times here, Dan. I'd love to go back to the Philippines because I've loved working there, and I have great friends and colleagues there, particularly those who've helped me write this book. Because as I said at the beginning, you know, this was drawn from the work of many Filipinos who fed into this. I think the question of whether I want to go back is you know, in the acknowledgements for this book, I've paid credit to very brave people who I couldn't actually name, who have taken real risks to talk to me. It's becoming more and more dangerous as a place to work for journalists. I feel that it's not going to get any less so in the future. Can you, Dan? Would you just remind me at the beginning of your question there?
Do you think Duterte has read it?
Oh yeah.
And have you
That's what I was
faced
gonna say.
any
So-
retaliation?
Okay, so look, when the book was published, we sent a copy to him at Malacanang, and we sent another copy to the Philippine embassy in Canberra. I don't know whether he's got it, but I have been fascinated as to how he would react. I personally think that the narcissist in him might actually be attracted to the fact that he's painted in the way that I have. Look, let's be clear. Although I have come across tonight as being highly critical of this man, there's a lot in this book which I hope will help to explain why he is the man he is. You know, he claims to have been abused as a schoolboy by a Catholic priest who was a well-known paedophile. This has a terrible bearing on him. You know, he had a difficult upbringing. There is no doubt about it. There are things also that as president and as mayor, you've got to credit him for doing. You know, the most amazing thing about Duterte, to me, is that while he was busy running death squads and killing street kids, he was also running a drugs rehabilitation center in Davao, which was ahead of its time. And he was attracting business and investment into the city like no other. He was supporting charities and looking after kids with cancer. He's capable of holding two balls in the air at the same time and capable of extraordinary double take. I don't know how he will react to this book. I like to think I will be able to go back to the Philippines. I really hope so.
Thanks very much. Next question, Dominic.
Dominic, you mentioned that the polls keep going up for Duterte, which tells you two things possibly. One is that the polls are wrong, which is very common these days, or secondly, that people genuinely feel that they're better off under Duterte. So I was wondering if maybe you haven't given him credit for some success. Is there material benefit to these people? But one of the things that Duterte has done is taken on the Catholic Church. And he's the first president to do that. And there are many people that would argue that one of the key causes of the backwardness of the Philippines, the overpopulation, etc., is the Catholic Church. Now, Duterte has no respect for anybody, whether it's Pope Francis or Obama, as you mentioned. But he's actually stood up. So has there been an impact? Has something happened with the church? And as a corollary to that, how is the Catholic Church dealing with what's going on in the Philippines at the moment? Mass murder, it isn't. It's not up at Pol Pot's level at all. But it's very, very serious. It's over 10,000. How is the Catholic Church responding to what's been going on?
Okay, so look, with the polls question, there are two key polling groups in the Philippines. One is called Asia Pulse, and the other one is called Social Weather Report. They have varied in their analyses of what's going on, but by and large, they show a continuing high approval rate for Duterte. Some of this is, and the weird thing is that it's across social strata. It's from the very poor to the very rich. It's across educational groups, economic levels, whatever. I mean, he's still popular. Do you explain this by the fact that Filipinos feel better off? Well, I think they feel that, you know, Duterte, as a strong leader, has sort of made the Philippines feel good about itself. He might have had some contradictory policies about sort of China and about the Spratly Islands and all this sort of stuff, but by and large, he's well regarded. I don't think that the poor have particularly benefited from Duterte. Once again, there is no real trickle down to the lowest levels of society. I think the argument that the economy is doing well, it's probably doing well despite Duterte. It was doing well before him. Coming to the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church, the Philippines was known as a country that spent 500 years in a convent and then 50 years in Hollywood after 50 years of US colonialism. But the 50 years in the convent were deeply damaging to this society. It was, it left the Philippines as a country that was second only to the Vatican in how Catholic it was. This is a country in which you can't get divorced. This is Duterte's own marriage was annulled. It's the only way to end a marriage. Its church attendance rates have sloped off massively in recent years, from 60%, 20 years ago to 30% today, and it's possible that the notion of the Sunday Christian, the Sunday Catholic, the Christmas Catholic, the Easter Catholic has allowed an increasingly secular Philippines to accommodate a president who holds these values. There is no doubt, though, that the Catholic Church has been discredited by all sorts of scandal over many years, and Duterte has played on that and has talked up books. He gives his favorite book to give out to people is called The Altar of Secrets. He gave it out recently. You probably saw in the last few days that he was busy sort of force kissing some Filipino worker on stage. Was it in Hong Kong or something? Yeah. And he gave her a copy of this book, The Altar of Secrets, which is an expose of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has dealt with it. That's what you asked. Sort of very, very slowly. They found it took a long time for them to find their feet. Back in the Marcos time, Cardinal Jaime Sin, the fabulously named Cardinal Sin, was at the forefront. He was at the absolute vanguard of the fight against Marcos. The Catholic Church today is a shadow of itself. There are bishops and priests like the one who you saw in my report who stand up and are counted in their criticism of Duterte. And after the killing of that young teenager, Kian de los Santos, the church bells rang out for 40 days in memory of him and against the drugs war. But the church has been slow to stand up to Duterte. Of that, there is no doubt.
Last question, please, Kim.
My name is Mira Kim, a Korean, ethnic Korean, but Thai national. Well, my question is not to do with Catholic Church, but families, like less than 10 families, having the whole country. Is it changing since Duterte?
Is he taking on the oligarchs?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because there are people in this room who are better qualified to talk to you about the families that run the Philippines. But there is this is a country that has been run by oligarchs and families for many, many years. What Duterte promised was to get rid of all of that, to move on. But what people seemingly didn't realize, perhaps they did and just ignored it, I don't know. Duterte he's an oligarch himself. He comes from a dynasty, a political dynasty, albeit a provincial one, from down south in Mindanao, which was a place that has never had a president before. So many Mindanaos were very proud to have a president who represented them in Malacanang and thought that this day would never happen. But actually, he's just a rich boy, a privileged boy from the south, whose father was a governor and himself was an oligarch, and who has given to his cronies so much of the power which he wields today. He's surrounded by the same people that surrounded him for 30 years or 20 years in Davao as mayor, and he remains in Malacanang with those very same people today.
Okay, that's not an incredibly cheerful note to finish on, but thanks very much, Jonathan, and thank you all for attending tonight.
Thank you.